Okay, in this lecture, we're going to focus on boundaries as a very important concept if you want to make sense of, work with, and optimize what you are doing in a project team or in an organization. Um, okay, I'm first going to talk about types of boundaries. The first one, the boundary of time. This is, for instance, in a project context. When does the project start? When does it stop? What are some of the key milestones or deadlines that's been put in place? In the example of the sports match here on the picture, it says that the match starts at a specific time and it ends at a specific time. Anything before that or after that is outside of the boundaries of time. Um, so maybe just taking one step back. So all these boundaries together that I'm going to discuss one by one, all these types of boundaries, they create the container, the space within which your work is done. So that is what needs to be done, by when, by whom. All of that provides boundaries within which work is done. So we have the boundaries of time, for instance, the time that the meeting starts, or the time that the meeting ends. It's something to keep in mind. If you see, for instance, that um, there's a pattern where meetings start late, or when you get to the end of the meeting and the meeting just continues over that boundary, anxiety immediately starts to go up because people start to wonder, okay, when is this going to end? Because we thought it's going to be an hour meeting, now we are at an hour and a half. So if you can stay within the boundaries that you've set, it contains anxiety and it enables the flow of work. If we speak about the space boundary, it refers, or the territory boundary is the physical space where work is done. In the sports example, there's a very clear demarcation of when you're out of bounds and when you are within the field of play. But in an office environment, you have your office space. Now, with COVID-19 and working from home, the space boundary is one of the boundaries that has really been affected. Seeing that people are now sharing a virtual space, but the physical spaces are very different. And then in our physical spaces now, in the work from home space, it's also often, I think, many negotiations in many households regarding how to deal with the boundaries of space in the household. So where can I work? Where can I have some quiet for my work? And where can the family be? And whenever there's a complexity and a vagueness and a conflict around a boundary, there's room for many emotions, frustrations, etc. And we see that happening, I think, now in our respective spaces. So if we put the two together, the boundary of time and the boundary of space, we say within this frame of time and in this space, this is where the work is done. It could be the construction site, that is where the work is done. And at that site, there are certain rules and regulations that apply in terms of health and safety, etc. When the time boundary is a little bit all over the place, or when the space boundary is vague, conflicted, and overlapping, there's a lot of room for confusion and a lot of energy that could have been directed at work gets lost. The boundary of task, so that is what is part of my task or not, or the project team's scope, or the purpose of the project team, the ultimate goal of the project. That is the task, and that task then of course gets subdivided into various subtasks that gets allocated to people in different roles. So all these different roles in the team have certain tasks connected to the roles, and all of them roll up into the primary task of your project team. So the primary task is the boundary around the task says what is part of the job and what is not part of the job. And I think if you think of cases with projects with clients where you don't manage that well, you can see that sometimes there becomes a difference between what the client expects or starts to expect, and what the service provider thinks is actually part of the task. And again, if there's a discrepancy between what is expected in terms of the task boundary and what is delivered in terms of the task boundary, then there's some conflict and frustration and noise in the system. The role boundary is if you envision your role as being demarcated around the role, and everything that is within that boundary forms part of what is part of your role. It's a little bit different from a job description, where in a typical job description, we list every little thing that you must do. But the description of the role, a good understanding of what my role entails, gives freedom to the person in the role as to how exactly the different activities that will accomplish that role will look like. For instance, I think if you look at this of the picture on the rugby field, the fly half has a certain role that is different from the role of a flanker on the field. The fly half doesn't get a list of activities from number 1 to number 1,000 of what they must do every moment. It's a broad understanding of what the role is entailing, depending on how the primary task or vision or goal and style for the match for the team will be. They will also then have agreements as to what the role will be. Sometimes we overstep our role boundary and we kind of move into someone else's role, and we start to do something that's actually not part of our responsibility but part of someone else's responsibility. And I think you've also experienced it. As soon as that boundary starts to be crossed without any communication or negotiation, then again, energy gets lost because there's frustration, there's noise that is now wasted on the thinking and the feelings that are that have to do with this conflict on where my role stops and where someone else's role starts. Also, in terms of role boundaries, sometimes we don't do everything that is part of our role, and you can also see that then becomes a problem. But to have these boundaries in mind is a way to which to hold the team as a system in mind. It's a system with boundaries, and within these boundaries the work gets done. So far we spoke about the boundaries of time. So when must it be done, where, what is exactly the thing that you're going to do, and who is going to do what. Those boundaries provide the basic frame as to what needs to be, as to how the team as a system functions. The membership boundary refers to who is in and who is out. So on the rugby field, there's exactly 15 players on the field unless one is sent off. The others are sitting next to the field on the bench, but there's no uncertainty about who is in and who is out. So who is part of the team, who is not part of the team. That is the membership boundary. The boundary of authority. So what is within my authority and what not? Where does my authority start? Where does it stop? As I said, sometimes some people only take up a part of their role. In order to kind of fully own your role, you also have to take up your authority in your role fully. Sometimes we overstep that. We kind of over-authorize ourselves, and then we step into someone else's role, and that's when the boundary of authority gets crossed. So no matter on which hierarchical level you are, whether you're a shareholder, a board member, the CEO, ExCo member, project director, project manager, on each of those levels, there's a certain boundary around what your authority entails. And whenever there's an infringement on that boundary, you've also experienced, I'm sure, in your work, that when there's something infringing on that boundary, then it becomes complicated. The identity boundary is what we identify with. So sometimes companies have a strong corporate identity. Sports teams have identities. They show that by the colors that they are wearing. So sometimes we also identify quite strongly with certain parts of the job that we are busy with. But the identity boundary, in essence, is what are the things that I identify with as a team that then says, well, this is what we are like, and we are not like that, we are like this, creates this identity boundary. The political boundary, sometimes you get certain subdivisions that also have certain, let's say, interests that may not always be aligned. And so the boundary of what is in my interest and what is in the interest of the other becomes the political boundary. Let's say in a sports team, you get the kind of a strong identification. So if we talk about the identity boundary amongst the forwards, and a strong identification amongst the backs, or a strong identification around those on the bench, then they kind of become a little subgroup with a sub-identity, and may sometimes do things that are in the interest of this subgroup and not necessarily in the interest of the project as a whole. So that is something to check and keep an eye on. All these types of boundaries that I've discussed now, they all work in conjunction with each other. Again, to create the holding space, the environment, the container within which work gets done. And the more these boundaries get perforated or diminished or crossed, it's like you have a bowl and you put holes in the bowl and the energy seeps out. Mental energy, human energy that could have been used for the work. Okay, so let's speak a bit about the function of boundaries. Why do we have boundaries? So first of all, as I said earlier, boundaries provide the container that holds and channel energy. If you think of a river and the banks of a river, the energy is being held and it can flow. We don't want to have so many boundaries that it blocks the flow. So you want to have boundaries that are good enough in place to further the work towards a primary task as well as possible. So that's the first function of boundaries, to hold and contain and channel energy. Also containing anxiety. If there are no boundaries or weak boundaries or weakly defined boundaries or ambiguous boundaries, people's anxiety tend to go up. So if people are uncertain about their roles, or they feel that someone else is stepping into their space all the time, or their boss is moving into their level of authority, or what I need to do in terms of my task boundary changes every day without me being told that it's going to change, all those things make our anxiety go up. And when our anxiety is high, we have less access to our creativity. It's as if our mental energy goes somewhere and we don't have that energy available for creative and productive problem-solving work. So you want to, as a project manager, you want to make sure that the boundaries are intact enough, and there where boundaries are changing, that you can communicate that proactively enough so that people have a sense of security, and if I link to the next point there, a sense of coherence, that things are actually holding together. That makes it easier to focus on the work. You know, the work itself is complex enough without having to be even further complicated by also messing around the boundaries of who needs to do what, by when, and what level of authority we are at. All those things make things a little bit more predictable and gives us a sense that it's holding together so that we can do our work. If I speak about integrity, you know, if we undermine the boundaries that is supposed to contain and direct our work, in a way we take away the integrity, the holding together. The other word for that is the system becomes corrupt. The boundaries are corrupted. The boundaries can't hold and contain the work anymore. And we speak about corruption as if it's only something that happens at government level. Corruption is whenever we do anything that undermine or breach or perforates the boundaries that are supposed to keep things together, to give us integrity as we stay together. If your boundaries that you are setting in your team and that you're working with are clear and stable and predictable and well communicated and not all over the place, then those boundaries can become a very valuable diagnostic tool to see how things are going. So, for instance, if people know exactly what is expected of them by when, then when I reach that time boundary of when it needs to be done, and I see stuff has not been done at the level of quality and at the time, then I know something is not right. But if I don't observe that boundary, if I let it slide, if I don't check at that time, then I can't use the boundary as a diagnostic to say how are things. If someone continuously oversteps someone else's authority boundary or role boundary, if that becomes a pattern, and the boundary was clear in the first place, then I can know there's something wrong here that we need to work with. Maybe there's not a clear enough understanding on both sides as to where the one role stops and the other one starts. So then that needs to be clarified. Maybe there's someone with a very strong political agenda in order to further their interest, and then they are overstepping certain boundaries. You don't know yet what that may be, but when the boundaries are in place, you can use the boundaries as a frame to see, okay, well, here the boundaries have been crossed. What does this say about us? Why did this happen? What is happening in the dynamics of the team that makes us, as a system, cross these boundaries at these places? We know that crossing, perforating, breaking boundaries is not good for our work because our work needs to be contained. We don't want anxiety to be too high. We want to direct our creative energy towards the task. But if we see that we are, even though we know this in our rational minds, we can see that the way in which we act, we are actually poking holes in the boundaries that need to keep all of these things together. Now we have to ask ourselves, why does this happen, so that we can stop doing this and improve the team? Remember, we said initially, all teams are imperfect, and then also the way in which we work with the boundaries are imperfect. But if we can do as good a job as possible of that, then the boundaries can become a very good, not only container, but also an indicator. It shows you where to look if you want to see whether things are going in the right direction or not. Sometimes we only figure out that things are not working once there's an explosion, once the deadline is missed, or there's some other explosion. We want to know much sooner than that something is not right. And by paying close attention what happens at the boundaries, can very early on tell you, okay, there's something not right. Let's fix this before it becomes a big problem later. Boundaries also regulate the interaction between systems. As we said when we spoke about the teams as systems, each system has a boundary. And then across these boundaries is how the systems interact with each other. So if, for instance, if I go to my client's offices, I enter into the office space, I enter into their spatial boundary and into the client's boundary on that side. Sometimes I will change the way in which I dress when I go to a client. There are certain things that I will do to show to myself and to the client that I am aware that we are now interacting on the boundary between two systems. If you think of let's say the border of a country with a border post and customs, there's a regulatory function there that regulates what gets into the other country and what is allowed this side. So the boundaries regulate the way in which different systems interact with each other. In a hierarchy in an organization, there may be a certain boundary set, a certain time and space and task of a meeting at a specific frequency, which is again a time boundary, between top management and the project director, in order to provide an opportunity for the project director to give feedback to top management as to how things are going. So a specific interaction mechanism is being created to hold and contain communication between systems, so between the project team and the senior management of the organization. Something is put in place to channel that interaction. Interaction regarding reporting how things are going, but also interaction regarding telling senior management, listen, we need from you X, Y, and Z. Otherwise, we are going to get A, B, and C going wrong. So that kind of proactive communication. When the mechanism is set, another way of saying that is when the boundaries are created for that communication to happen up front. So up front we say, you know what, in order to accomplish the task of good communication between the project team and top management, we are going to have a meeting at this time frequency, and in that meeting will be these members, that's a membership boundary, and we are going to communicate regarding how the project is going. If you don't do that, it means you leave it up to chance that there will be proper communication. And in the hectic busyness of life, it may mean that you see, you know what, it's been 2 months and we haven't had any feedback yet from this team. You know, it's not because the team is not working. Maybe the team is working so frantically that they are not getting to giving some feedback upwards. And because that doesn't happen, there may start to become feelings in senior management, but so there's something wrong with the project team. Whereas if only there was a regular mechanism, that regular mechanism needn't be a meeting. It can be an email update or an update on your project flow chart, whatever mechanism you may use. But if it's agreed upon beforehand, it regulates the interaction between these different systems. Okay, let's focus a little bit about the process in which we establish and manage boundaries. Until now, I spoke about different types of boundaries. We then spoke about the function of boundaries to contain energy, etc. And now let's see, how do you go about establishing and managing boundaries? Okay, so first of all, it's a question of setting or negotiating boundaries. So depending on the authority relation, sometimes boundaries are just a given. Let's say the laws of the land, the legal framework within which we all operate, that's more or less set, and we are working within that. Sometimes also the boundaries in terms of time, quality, what needs to be done are fixed, set. You can't do anything about that. Other boundaries, again, can be negotiated. Be that as it may, the boundaries has to be created. Sometimes they are set, sometimes they are negotiated. If boundaries that can be negotiated are arbitrarily set by the one in charge, it's possible that people won't have the buy-in to hold themselves to those boundaries. So if a boundary can reasonably be negotiated between you and your team, then do that, because then you can get their buy-in. Let's say in the working from home situation, me as a leader can tell everyone, listen, we are working from home now, but I don't care, we're still going to work 8 to 5. But maybe there's someone with small kids at home that could tell you, know what, can I maybe work from 6 to 8 and then take a break because I've got to do homeschooling with my kids from 8 till 10, and then I'll work again from 10 to, If it's possible to negotiate boundaries in a mature way that is not going to affect negatively the task, I think that's an important caveat. The task is always the goalpost towards which we're working. But if it's possible to negotiate boundaries in a way that's not going to negatively affect the task, it is also possible then to get people's buy-in to actually hold themselves to the boundaries. If you are the team leader, it's really your responsibility to make sure that the boundaries that have been set are actually held. If you let one boundary slide, let's say a deliverable, someone has to give you a feedback report, a progress report on Friday. Friday comes, you don't get that report, and if you don't say anything about it, and only another week later you ask about that, the message that goes out to the team is that this boundary of having the report on time is not so important. So of course, next time when that same thing comes along, I won't necessarily be stressed to have it in on time, because I've seen now in the past that nothing happens when I don't give it in on time. So a norm starts to be created that certain boundaries can be let slip by. The problem with that, though, is the moment I start to see that this boundary isn't really as serious, I also start to ask myself, but which of the other boundaries are also not that serious? And then you can start to see it's as if the team starts to fizzle out or fray at the edges. Many things aren't happening as sharp and pinpointed and clinically as required. But if you can hold the boundary, and there are ways and ways of holding boundaries, you don't have to first wait until something goes wrong. You can, before the deadline, send an email to someone, say, just want to remind you that on Friday I'm expecting this report. Is everything still okay? Will it be fine? Then it means you are maintaining the mindset continuously that certain things are expected at specific times, the boundaries are important, and that you value those boundaries. Another example, if you are in let's say you are chairing a meeting, and beforehand the agreement was that the meeting is going to end at a specific time. It's going to start at a specific time and end at a specific time. If you chair the meeting, don't start it late, because if the starting time of the meeting can slip, what other boundaries can also slip? If it's 9, start at 9. Hold that boundary, and then when you get to the end of the meeting, it's really a sign of respect to everyone in the meeting to respect the end boundary of time. If you get to that point and you cross over, in that moment that you go over the end time of the meeting, you are disempowering and deauthorizing the entire team. Because if you are the one in charge and to let it go over time, you don't know, some people in the team may have other meetings set up with clients or other stakeholders for after your meeting. Now they can't get to that, so their power and authority to do their job the way in which they, as mature members of your team, have scheduled their day is suddenly taken away from them, and all the power sits with you. They need to wait until the meeting ends before they then can get on with their lives. But if you can show that if they can depend, knowing that this meeting will end at that time, it means they can schedule their next meeting and they can continue with their lives directly after that. It's a sign of mutual trust and respect. And it doesn't take away people's sense of agency. And it also symbolically shows that here we are taking the boundaries that we set together, we are taking those boundaries seriously. Whether those boundaries are the boundaries of when something needs to happen, how much it must cost, what the quality level is, who needs to do what. If we keep all these things up front in our minds and we value these things, it means we value the project as a system and we value the work that needs to be done. Whereas if we let things slip, we don't hold the boundaries, it means it becomes blurrier, and whenever any boundary becomes blurry, anxiety goes up, frustration goes up, and energy that's needed for work is lost. The last one, the next one, changing boundaries. So of course things change. We are living in a complex world, things change very often. So when there's a specific boundary that has to change, of course, change the boundary, but do it, if it is a boundary that can be changed. Of course, there are certain standards that you can't change, but just let's say the time of a meeting, for instance, or the scope of someone's role, or the scope of the task of the project, these things sometimes have to change. And if it has to change, it's important to communicate that change proactively. So you can't just willy-nilly change a boundary without letting people know. Sometimes you also have to let people know why, so that they can see why this is happening. I would say one should be very discerning. You should really think through which boundaries you are changing. So let's say your internal progress meeting, if that gets postponed every time that something else that seems to be more urgent comes on the table, the message is that it is not so urgent for us as a team to interact. So the more you chop and change boundaries just because your calendar is all over the place, the more confusing it becomes. So it then doesn't create the sense that things are actually held together. So sometimes boundaries change. If they do have to change, do it proactively, give people the reasons why, be as transparent as possible, and then people know where they stand and they know, okay, yes, we make this adaptation and we go ahead. But if you make adaptations so often, then people don't know where they're standing or where they're sitting or what they're supposed to do, and energy is lost and sense of security goes down. Finally, I also want to emphasize that if you are the leader, it is extremely important that you hold yourself accountable to the boundaries that's been set by yourself. If you undermine the boundaries, if you don't submit yourself to the boundaries set by the team, then it puts all other boundaries in question. If there's corruption at the highest level in the country, then it's as if lawlessness start to creep in on all different levels. Because if the one in charge can't hold themselves to the law, why should I? If you're the project manager, if your stuff is always late, why must my stuff be on time? If you are late for our meetings or you just miss a meeting without saying anything, why should I? Yes, you can miss a meeting because you have more power and you are at a higher hierarchical authority level, so it's in your power to just chop and change boundaries willy-nilly, maybe to just not comply with a boundary at all. But each time you do that, just be aware of the fact that you are undermining the project as a system yourself. Because if you don't hold yourself to the boundaries, why should anyone else? And then it becomes a lot harder work to get the project neatly and streamlined within boundaries, focused on its work. So be very careful. If you have an appointment, let's say you are the project manager and you have an appointment with a more junior person in the team, yes, in your calendar on that morning when you wake up, you might feel, I don't want to do this appointment now, I've got something else to do. Just hold in mind that it's a boundary that was set by you and that you are now not going to adhere to, you're going to maybe shift it around. The message it gives is that this is not so important. Whereas if you hold the boundary, if you give that person your time at the time that you said it would, it just creates the sense that what we do here is important. Even the person in a lower rank, what they do is also important and should work. And I, as the one in charge, need to respect what this person is doing enough and respect the person enough and their role enough for me to hold the agreement that I made with that person, that we will have a time to talk about what they're doing or whatever the case may be. So be very careful. The higher we move up in the hierarchy in our careers, the more authority we get, but also the more powerful we become. We are often not aware of how powerful we are. We are often not aware of the impact that we have if we diminish boundaries or not hold ourselves to boundaries when we are high up in the hierarchy. The more power you have, the more influence you have, and the higher the stakes. Each time you break or don't go with a boundary, the impact of that is just higher the higher you are up in the system. Boundaries can sometimes be very complex. So sometimes you are in two roles at the same time. Sometimes you are in the role of project manager in this sense, but in the meeting hereafter, you may be in the role of client, or you may be in the role of specialist on someone else's project. And on this project, where you are the project manager, may be a member of your team who is your boss in a different project or in a different organizational setting. In all those cases, the boundaries are quite complex. So it's important to keep in mind that, okay, now in this meeting, this is the task of this meeting. So if I say task, it means I refer to the task boundary. The task of this meeting is to discuss project ABC. For project ABC, I am the project manager, so I'm going to chair this meeting. The membership boundary, so the people who are included in this meeting are these people. Some of them are my bosses in other situations, but in this meeting, I'm the one in charge, and I'm going to conduct the meeting then in a way that is conducive for the primary task of the meeting. I'm not going to, because someone else in the team is more senior than me in a different setting of the organization, I'm not going to abdicate my own authority and my own responsibility and give over to that person to act as if they are actually in charge. At the moment that the real boundaries are now being replaced by assumed boundaries, things become messy and very complex. So when you are in a situation where the boundaries are complex in terms of role and authority and membership, you need to just take some time to really think. So for instance, and this often happens, someone sends out an email to the people involved in a specific project, but they leave out one or two names. Very often, not because of intentionally leaving out the names, it's just they've been thinking about the project, thinking about the people involved, but things happen so fast, and we are also involved in other projects with some of these people and some other people, that if you don't just take a minute to just make sure, listen, what project am I working with now? Okay, who are the people that needs to be involved here? Who must be included in the email? And then include everyone that falls within the boundary of whatever that communication is about. Don't just leave people out because you think, you know what, they are not supposed to be part of the communication, but actually they are. If someone is within the formal boundary, include them. Keep a very astute clinical focus on the boundary so that in all the complexity, things don't get completely messy. Something that you can be sure of is that people will attack boundaries. We all do that. You know, if you tell a child, don't go there, don't touch that thing, what does the child do? They walk there, they touch that thing. Why? They want to check. Firstly, they want to check whether what you say is really what you are serious about. So they want to check whether you are really the one in charge. So if you say don't touch there and I touch there and nothing happens, then I doubt whether you are really in charge. Also, if you say don't go there and I go there and you do nothing, I start to become a bit more unsafe because I'm not sure what is really allowed and what is not allowed. So people test the boundaries in order to check and whether the one in charge is really in charge, check whether it's safe to be in that team, because if the one in charge isn't really in charge, who is in charge? And that really diminishes people's sense of security in the team. So especially when a new leader is appointed, sometimes a new leader is appointed from the ranks, sometimes they're appointed from outside. No matter what, they can expect that they will be challenged. The way in which people challenge the one in charge is usually not by directly confronting them. It's usually by subtly challenging the boundaries that have been set in place by the one in charge. So it's easier for me to indirectly challenge you by challenging the boundary you've put in place than to just tell you up front, you know what, I'm not sure whether you will be capable to do this job. So I just wanted you to know that. We usually don't do that. We are more subtle. It's something that very often happens unconsciously. It's not that we intentionally think, how can I undermine my leader by not adhering to their boundaries. It's sometimes a kind of an underlying feeling that we are not fully aware of that leads us to just be a little bit late for this meeting that's been set by our new manager, or by just delivering this thing a bit late. It's a way of, it's an unconscious way that we check whether the boundaries are real, whether the person who's in charge of these boundaries also thinks that they are real, whether they're taking this seriously, and eventually whether it is safe to be in this team. So whenever you are in charge, there's a number of boundaries that you are now presiding over, boundaries of time, place, task, territory, role, authority. It's a whole kind of a web of boundaries that's being created in order to hold and contain the work. If you start to see attacks on the boundaries or challenges or tests on these boundaries, some of these boundaries are being crossed, one hypothesis that is usually also then in one's mind is, how is the challenge of boundaries also a challenge of my authority? Not to take it personally, because it's a very normal thing to challenge authority, and then to think about your response in terms of holding the boundaries. If you let boundaries slip, and this can be very tricky, if you are in a project where the one of the project members could be more senior than you are in a different part of the organization. If that person then doesn't hold themselves to the boundaries of what needs to be done by when, for instance, it can be quite tricky to hold them accountable. And if you don't hold them accountable, what is the message? That you are not strong enough to hold the boundaries for this team, and that message also gets picked up by the other members of the team. So even though it may be difficult, remember, as a project manager, in your task, in your authority, in your role, is to keep an eye on everything that may hamper or impede the potential of this team and to deliver a successful project. And if you don't do that, you are failing in your job. So if someone else, even though they are maybe of a higher status in a different level of the organization, comes and challenges certain boundaries, you must be very aware that everyone in the team is aware of the fact that these boundaries are being challenged, and then you must be really busy, you must really consider how to approach and how to deal with it. You can't just let it slide. You needn't launch a retaliatory attack to humiliate the person in front of everyone. That won't be a good strategy, because you still also need them in the overall system that you are functioning in. But think of ways in which to be firm on the boundaries with empathy for the other. I think that's the key here. You want to be firm with empathy. So being firm doesn't mean you have to, you have to be a dictator. But you can still be firm and still acknowledge that you realize this is going on, or whatever may be the case, but the boundary remains firm. Okay, that is the end for now. Thank you. We'll have a discussion in class a bit later.